Imagine this: the power goes out. It's the dead of winter, the wind is howling outside, and the temperature inside your house starts to plummet. You check your phone, 1% battery left. You've got blankets, sure, but how long will they last? For most of us, this is a nightmare scenario, a temporary inconvenience that feels like a catastrophe. Now, imagine it's not temporary. Imagine there's no power grid to fix, no electric company to call, no central heating, no electric blankets, no hope of the lights ever coming back on. Welcome to the Middle Ages. So, how on earth did people survive the brutal winters of medieval Europe without freezing solid? You might picture them shivering in dark, drafty stone castles, huddled together for warmth, and you'd be partly right. But they also had some incredibly clever, low-tech solutions that kept their homes surprisingly warm, sometimes for days on end. Today, we're going to uncover the lost art of medieval heating, and you'll be shocked at how ingenious these so-called primitive techniques really were. Forget what you think you know about drafty castles. Let's dive into the cozy, smoky, and surprisingly sophisticated world of the medieval home in winter. First, let's talk about the heart of any medieval home, the hearth. This wasn't just a fancy fireplace for decoration. In most early medieval houses, especially for common folk, the hearth was a simple, open fire pit right in the middle of the main room. There was no chimney. Smoke would just drift up and find its way out through a small hole in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. It sounds incredibly smoky, and it was. People's eyes would have been watering constantly, but that smoke served a purpose beyond just being a nuisance. It helped to cure meats hanging from the rafters and kept insects away. The real genius of the central hearth was its efficiency in radiating heat. Unlike a modern fireplace tucked against a wall, a central fire radiates heat in all 360 degrees, warming the entire room more evenly. People would cook, eat, work, and sleep around this central fire. It was the social and survival hub of the household. The floor was usually just packed earth, which, once warmed by the fire, would hold on to that heat for a long time, acting as a primitive form of underfloor heating. But what about the fuel? They didn't just burn any old log. Wood was valuable. People would practice coppicing and pollarding, which are sustainable ways to harvest wood without killing the tree. They'd cut branches that would regrow, ensuring a steady supply. But even more common was peat, or dried animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. Dried dung, or surface fuel, was a slow-burning, readily available source of heat. It might not smell the best, but when you're freezing, you're not picky. The goal was a slow, smoldering fire that could last through the night with minimal tending. Now, let's move up the social ladder to the castles and manor houses. By the later Middle Ages, the rich had a major upgrade: the wall fireplace with a chimney. This was a game changer. It moved the fire from the center of the room to the side and, most importantly, channeled the smoke out of the living space. This made the air much cleaner and allowed for the construction of multi-story buildings. Since you no longer had smoke filling up the upper floors, these fireplaces were massive, some big enough to walk into. They could burn huge logs called Yule logs that were designed to smolder for days. But here's the problem with a big open fireplace. Most of the heat goes straight up the chimney. They were actually incredibly inefficient. So, how did they solve this? First, they didn't try to heat the whole castle. That was impossible. They focused on heating specific rooms: the Great Hall, the Lord's private chamber, or solar, were the priority. These rooms were often located on upper floors, away from the cold, damp ground level. The key to keeping these rooms warm wasn't just the fire itself, but insulation. And this is where medieval people got really creative. Think tapestries. Those huge, beautiful wall hangings you see in museums weren't just for decoration. They were a crucial layer of insulation. A thick, woven wool tapestry hung against a cold stone wall created a pocket of air that dramatically reduced heat loss. It was like wrapping your room in a giant blanket. They would cover every available wall, turning a cold stone chamber into a much cozier, more colorful space. Floors were another source of cold. Stone floors are brutal in winter, so they would cover them with layers of rushes or straw. This wasn't just a thin scattering. It could be a thick, insulating mattress on the floor. They would periodically add fresh layers on top, and in wealthy homes, they demix in fragrant herbs like lavender or chamomile to combat the inevitable smells and pests that came with having dried vegetation all over your floor. This practice, known as strewing, was an essential part of medieval life. But what about the biggest source of drafts? Windows. Glass was incredibly expensive, a luxury only the very wealthy or the church could afford. And even then, it was often in small panes, held together by lead. For most people, a window was just a hole in the wall. To keep the cold out, they used wooden shutters that could be latched tight. To let in light without the freezing wind, they would stretch oiled linen or parchment, or even thinly sliced pieces of horn across the opening. These materials were translucent, not transparent, so you couldn't see through them clearly, but they let in a dim, filtered light while blocking the worst of the draft. Let's talk about the structure of the houses themselves. Peasant homes, often called cruck houses, were built with a simple wooden frame and walls made of wattle and daub. This is a lattice of woven wood, the wattle, packed with a sticky mixture of wet soil, clay, sand, straw, and animal dung, the daub. When this mixture dried, it created a surprisingly well-insulated wall, much better than bare stone. The roofs were thickly thatched with straw or reeds, which could be several feet thick, providing fantastic insulation from both the cold in winter and the heat in summer. Plus, animals often lived in the same building or in an attached section. The body heat from a cow or a few sheep in the next room could make a noticeable difference on a cold night. It was a smelly but effective way to share warmth. Now, let's go back to the fire. One of the most ingenious medieval inventions was the fireback. This was a heavy cast iron plate placed at the back of the fireplace. Stone absorbs heat, but iron absorbs it and radiates it back into the room much more effectively. So, even after the fire died down, the hot iron fireback would continue to radiate warmth for hours. It was a simple but brilliant heat storage device. Think of it as a low-tech radiator. And what about personal warmth? They couldn't just crank up a thermostat. Layering was key. Everyone, from peasants to kings, wore wool. Wool is a fantastic insulator, even when it gets a bit damp. They wore linen undergarments, then multiple layers of woolen tunics, leggings, and cloaks. At night, they wore nightcaps to prevent heat loss from their heads and slept under heavy woolen blankets or even animal furs. Beds themselves were designed for warmth. The four-poster bed wasn't just a status symbol. The heavy curtains could be drawn all around the bed, creating a small, enclosed tent. This trapped the body heat of the sleepers and shielded them from any drafts in the room. Several people, often the whole family or servants, would pile into one bed for shared warmth. It wasn't about privacy, it was about survival. For a little extra warmth, they had bed warmers. These were long-handled brass or copper pans. You'd fill the pan with hot coals from the hearth, close the lid, and then run it between the sheets to warm up the bed before you got in. It was basically a medieval electric blanket. So, let's put it all together. How do you stay warm for 48 hours without power, medieval style? Step 1. You have a well-insulated house with thick thatch on the roof and wattle and daub walls. Step 2. You have a central hearth or a massive fireplace with a huge Yule log and a cast-iron fire back, smoldering away and radiating heat long after the flames are low. Step 3. Your walls are covered in heavy wool tapestries, and your floors have a thick layer of insulating rushes. Step 4. Your windows are sealed with wooden shutters or oiled linen. Step 5. You and your entire family are dressed in multiple layers of wool and are all piled into a curtained bed that's been pre-warmed with a pan of hot coals. When you combine all these strategies, you get a system that, while not as convenient as modern central heating, was incredibly effective. It was a holistic approach that combined smart building design, efficient fuel use, clever heat storage, and personal insulation. They didn't heat the space, they heated the people within the space. They created small, warm microclimates within their homes. It shows us that comfort isn't just about high-tech gadgets. It's about understanding the principles of heat and insulation and using the resources you have. So next time your power goes out, maybe don't panic. Just think like a medieval peasant, grab an extra blanket, and maybe don't bring the cow inside. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments which medieval survival trick surprised you the most. See you next time.